Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Solimar Salas. I'm the Vice President for Museum Content and Programming at the Museum of Latin American Art, or MOLA. And today I'm with you as the California Association of Museums Strategic Action Committee leader. I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules for today's session. For the Green Museum seminar that we'll be having today. I want to acknowledge the CAM staff, Lacey and Addie, who will be on hand to assist with any issues that arise throughout the afternoon. Also, a big thank you to Lacey, Addie, as well as Celeste, who are part of the CAM staff and that make this possible for us to bring to you. Thank you for all the work that they've done and that they keep doing to keep CAM updated with all these topics. Live captioning for today will also be provided for the presentations. A link to access these live captioning has been posted to the chat box, or will be posted to the chat box. It's already there. And it is also available to be embedded in Zoom by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to use the chat and we'll be sure to help you with that. We also want to let you know, and you may have received this already by email, CAM has a code of conduct to provide a safe, inclusive, and respectful learning and networking environment for us all. We ask that you adhere to this code of conduct, a link to which has been posted in the chat box. If you are in violation of it, CAM staff will remove you from the program. To report a violation of the code of conduct, please send a direct message to Lacey or Addie. And thank you for keeping the discussions healthy and productive for all of us. We also want to take the opportunity today for land acknowledgement. As we begin this event, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. A land acknowledgement is a critical step towards working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnerships and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. We honor and are grateful for the land we occupy and recognize the ongoing damage of settler colonialism. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. I am on the traditional territory of the Tongva and Kizh peoples. We are located in Long Beach, California. I encourage you to name and acknowledge the Native peoples where you are located in the chat box. If you want some help identifying who these Indigenous communities are, we are placing in the chat a link to an online map that can provide you with this information. Feel free, I'll give a few seconds for all of us to type in the chat our land acknowledgements. Thank you to everybody that's been updating the chat box. Feel free to keep updating that with your land acknowledgement. And we also want to thank the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands for the sponsorship to support the development of this program. Today, we're going to go quickly into the agenda overview for today's session. Today's program is the 4th Annual Green Museum Seminar, and this is a project of CAM's Strategic Action Committee. We'd like to thank the members of the Strategic Action Committee who helped produce today's event, and with whom I was lucky enough to work with: Vicky Stone, Micheline Gallagher, and Mark Catrick. Thank you. It takes a village. So it's without them and the CAM staff, this is harder to do. If you'd like to follow along the agenda for today, please look in the chat for a link to the detailed agenda that Addie's placing there. First, we will have a conversation on perspectives on environmental justice with Moisés Moreno-Rivera. He's Assistant Secretary for Equity and Environmental Justice from the California Natural Resources Agency. And Cameron Shaw, he's the Executive Director of the California African American Museum. Then we will hear from our panelists on museums and approaches to environmental justice. Following the panel, we will break into discussion groups, which you will be able to self-select by museum discipline and discuss how your museums can implement and support environmental justice. Finally, we will present the 2021 Secretary's Award for Excellence in Sustainability and hear from the award winners. You may notice that we are in Zoom meetings in a Zoom meeting format, and we do encourage you to unmute yourself during the Q&A sessions, and of course, during the breakout sessions to engage. If that is not possible for you, please feel free to use the chat box. And now I'd like to introduce the Strategic Action Committee co-chair, Mark Catrick, who will be serving as MC for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you all and enjoy.
Thank you, Solimar. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It really is my pleasure to be here joining you. As Soli mentioned, my name is Mark Catrick. I am the co-chair of the Strategic Action Committee for CAM, past board member for CAM, and I'll be kind of joining you in and out of everything that we're going to be doing to introduce some of our programming this afternoon. I work for the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles. I guess that would be as the Director of Operations and Experience at the museum. So it really is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce a couple of people that Soli just mentioned. Moisés Moreno-Rivera, the Assistant Secretary for Equity and Environmental Justice at the California Natural Resources Agency, and Cameron Shaw, the Executive Director of the California African American Museum. To tell you a little bit about each of our panelists this afternoon, Moises, as I said, is the Assistant Secretary for Equity and Environmental Justice. He took on this role in July 2021, and in this position is Moises is leading efforts to cultivate and embed principles of environmental justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion into the work of the agency. Prior to this particular role, Moises was the Assistant Tribal Liaison at the California Water Boards, where he led their internal tribal consultation policy implementation efforts and helped establish the framework for newly designated statewide tribal coordinators. He also helped institute the California EPA agency's Affinity Groups program, an agency-wide effort to create an equitable and inclusive community for historically underrepresented employee groups. Thank you so much for joining us. And Cameron Shaw was appointed the Executive Director of the California African American Museum in February 2021, after serving as the Deputy Director and Chief Curator since September 2019. Highlights of her leadership include the successful pivot of the museum's public programs from in-person to virtual, necessitated by the pandemic, something that I think all of us can relate to, and considerably broadening the California African American Museum's audience nationwide, and the recruitment of key staff members. A native of Los Angeles, Shaw was previously the Executive Director of New Orleans-based Pelican Balm, a nonprofit contemporary arts organization that was a forum for exhibitions, public programs, and arts journalism. And now I will turn it over to our speakers.
Muchas gracias, Mark, Celeste, and Cam for the invitation to share this space with you all today. As they mentioned, I am Moisés Moreno-Rivera, and I humbly serve as the inaugural Assistant Secretary for Equity and Environmental Justice at the California Natural Resources Agency. My colleague, Cameron Shaw, the Executive Director of the California African American Museum, within the CNRA family, will follow my presentation. So, you know, it is such a timely moment to be here with you all. So many global events have been made so present locally, right? In the human rights arena, we refer to this as glocal issues, global to local, or vice versa. You know, far too long, historically marginalized communities at the front line of environmental and climate injustices have been excluded from where decisions are made and have suffered the many health risks environmental degradations poses, such as lack of community amenities like parks and green spaces, along with high air pollution exposure, proximity to hazard waste sites, ingestion of water contaminants, heavy duty truck emissions, pesticides, dust, and energy production. And among that, limited active transportation facilities, community centers, and so much more. I come from one of those communities. For more than a year, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the disproportionate impacts of environmental harms on historically marginalized communities at the front lines of environmental and climate injustices, particularly communities of color. We've learned from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention that Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino individuals were almost 3 times more likely to be hospitalized and nearly twice more likely to die from COVID-19 as compared to their white counterparts. This is due to multiple factors, including inadequate or overcrowded housing, and an inability to work from home, unequal access to healthcare and safe outdoor space, a vast digital divide, and access to information, among others. Then earlier this month, the United States Environmental Protection Agency released a report titled Climate Change and Social Vulnerability in the United States. And this report it underscores what we in California already know about the struggle for environmental justice, that certain communities in the United States will bear a disproportionate burden of the negative health and environmental impacts from a warming planet, including more deaths from extreme heat and property loss from flooding in the wake of sea level rise. Both the pandemic and climate change have exposed further inequities in our collective society that everyone must play a role in addressing, inequities that have public health as a focal point, a core element of environmental justice. So in essence, what we do locally makes an impact and vice versa. And this is why I think it's important that we're here today. So what is environmental justice, and why are we here today? What are these perspectives that we're talking about? Well, historically marginalized communities at the front line of environmental and climate injustices across California and across the United States fought long struggles in the courts at the local government level and have helped pass legislation at the state level to ensure accountability in order to protect the health of communities and the environment. Environmental justice requires California leaders to respect and acknowledge that these frontline communities are experts in creating solutions for their communities, despite their historical exclusion from decision-making and from public resources and services. Environmental justice also asks for prioritizing, valuing prevention, public health, and improved quality of life. Decisions must do no further harm to frontline communities, seeking out and facilitating the involvement of those potentially affected, prioritizing tribal and frontline communities, meaningful community engagement, being proactive, taking an intersectional approach, and ultimately, of course, being responsive and respecting community expertise. In less than a month from now, there's much, much to celebrate, but also much work to do. In less than a month from now, it will be the 30th anniversary since the delegates of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit gathered in Washington, D.C. and drafted 17 principles of environmental justice, shifting laws and policies locally, regionally, and nationally. In fact, California was one of the first states in the nation to codify environmental justice in statute. So what does this mean and in regards to the impacts, right? So for decades, investments and resources have disproportionately been directed towards some communities over others, allowing these communities to enjoy better schools, parks, and roads, and being shielded from environmental harm. Communities of color are more likely to live near oil wells and face pollution, poor air quality, lack green spaces. Over 1 million Californians do not have access to safe drinking water. Heat waves are worse in Black and brown and low-income areas because their neighborhoods lack tree cover and because these areas tend to be freeways or industrial areas. Local officials must act boldly to reverse the legacy of racist discrimination embedded in decades of redlining, disinvestment, and environmental injustice. At CNRA, as an agency, we must reckon with this past and work towards where we strive to be. This also means looking inward and ensuring our own workplace is welcoming for all and reflective of the California of today. We must intentionally focus on our outreach and communication to historically underserved communities to collectively uplift their voices and acknowledge their power and expertise. I am delighted to share that the position that I hold within the agency is part of this reckoning. CNRA is changing the course of its history, and this year appointed its first inaugural assistant secretaries for tribal affairs and equity and environmental justice. In my role, I work towards institutionalizing principles of environmental justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and work to advance these principles in the agency's investments, programs, and policies. This includes an internal assessment and understanding of where we are, where we want to go, and the next steps for us to get there. In the realm of state-tribal relationships, the agency has also expanded our commitment to meaningful government-to-government consultations and partnerships with California Native American tribes. In this role, our Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs, Geneva E.B. Thompson, helps ensure the inclusion of tribal governments and communities within the work of the agency and advance opportunities for co-management, access of lands, and natural resources between tribal and state governments. Which leads me to the point of what we can all do, right? All levels of government and should aim to understand community needs by directly engaging these communities in conversation, to not just ask them to provide comment or consultation on decisions that affect them, but also take lead in decision-making. Government agencies should seek to increase the representation of historically underserved communities within their own ranks to help inform decision-making. This includes people of color, members of the LGBTQ+ community, rural communities, and other nature-deprived communities. Local advocates have long called for organizations and government to diversify their staff and leadership by integrating historically marginalized perspectives on nature in the fabric of resource decision-making and ending the exclusion of marginalized people from across the institutional power. Seeing diversity reflected in staff is a first step breaking down the cultural barriers that alienate and endanger people of color in parks and other natural areas. It is important that organizations also examine internal systems that could disadvantage employees from underrepresented backgrounds. Diverse voices should be elevated and equal. In modern times, museums are hubs that contextualize, educate, inform, and uplift pressing community struggles like those of environmental justice. Museums spark conversation. They spark interest and can most definitely inspire. Museums too have an instrumental role to play in advancing environmental justice. In this work, I've come to realize that communities, and just being from one of these communities, we long to be seen and meaningfully represented. Communities long to be educated on issues that impact them. They long to see their struggles visibly and with their stories adequately told. They long to not be intimidated by the institutions that surround them. And in the realm of tribal relationships, tribes long for their sovereignty to be respected and to not be seen as relics of the past, but as partners and rightful stewards of their cultural resources. As we think of present-day environmental injustices near your locations, here are some questions that I've been thinking about and for you to reflect upon as well is, how can the stories of these communities be represented in a language that your patrons can understand, whether they're children, adults, limited English speakers, elders, immigrants? How are you educating on matters pertaining to environmental justice? How are you involving your immediate community? And what is your relationship with the California tribal governments and indigenous communities that have ties to your space? To address these questions, it takes meaningful collaboration. Someone mentioned earlier that it takes a village. It sure does. We all have a role to play, and we are thankful that museums are involved in this conversation. It's never too late or too early to start. What you do locally makes an impact. I'll leave you with a quote from my favorite author, Eduardo Galeano. Many small people in small places doing small things can change the world. Again, thank you for the opportunity to share the space with you today. I will now turn it to Cameron Shaw to share the California African Americans Museum's journey in this effort. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Moy. It's always such a pleasure to hear your passion that you bring to this issue. And thank you for the introduction to environmental justice from that perspective. It's an honor to work alongside you and others at the California Natural Resources Agency who are working to provide solutions to the most urgent issues facing our state, our nation, and the world. I joined the California African American Museum, which also uses the acronym CAM, so I'll use that as I'm speaking today, hope not to confuse anyone. I joined as Deputy Director and Chief Curator in 2019, and I became Executive Director in February of this year. Before that, I was working in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I was the co-founder and director of a small arts nonprofit that provided a platform for arts criticism, exhibition making, and artist-centered public projects. And it was really in New Orleans that I witnessed firsthand artists and culture producers navigating the extremely hard work of rebuilding their city after Hurricane Katrina and the man-made disaster of the federal levee failure, while also responding to the ongoing and intertwined crises of rising sea levels, disappearing wetlands, oil spills, industrial pollution, and other environmental justices. Bearing witness to their work strengthened my belief that contemporary art could be a powerful tool for visualizing environmental crisis, but also for imagining its alternatives. And I came to believe wholeheartedly that art can offer a lens with which we can view challenging issues and navigate questions in everyday life with new perspective. When I began working at CAM, I immediately saw an opportunity in our relationship as a state-funded museum and department under the Natural Resources Agency. CAM was founded in 1977 as the first museum of African American art, history, and culture fully funded by a state. But in 2021, we were in a unique position as a government agency, a trusted community gathering space, and a respected arts and cultural institution. And we could leverage that unique position to connect our audiences to images, ideas, people, and other resources that could deepen their ability to engage, to think critically, to self-advocate, and to take action on issues of environmental justice affecting their daily lives and communities. This year, we've launched an initiative that I'm calling Black Lives, Green Justice. And through this initiative, we will examine the intersections of Black life and some of the most pressing issues of our time. Many of the issues Moi outlined in speaking to you today, environmental justice issues that include mitigating climate change and environmental pollution, increasing safe and equitable access to green and leisure space, and advocating for fair architectural and agricultural and labor practices, all which do the work of improving public health outcomes. Our central questions will be, how do communities of color lead and shape public discourse around land use and natural resource stewardship? How can we uplift the work that has been done historically alongside the work being done today to build new, sustainable, and healthy relationships to the environment for generations to come? Black Lives, Green Justice is just one of 4 investigative pillars leading our work in exhibitions and public programs. And we're looking to build future opportunities for publishing, convening, and other forms of resource sharing, as we also articulate more publicly the values and goals driving this initiative in the months and years to come. Today, I'd like to briefly share 2 projects that help demonstrate how this is practically taking shape. And I'll stop for a minute to share my screen. Great. Looks like you can see what I'm seeing now. So the first is our current exhibition with artist and advocate Latoya Ruby Frazier. This installation image is her current exhibition at CAM, The Last Cruise, which will be on view through March 2022 and is presented with the USC School of Architecture, USC Roski School of Art and Design, and USC Visions and Voices, the Art and Humanities Initiative. So The Last Cruise focuses specifically on the lives of workers at the General Motors plant in Lordstown, Ohio, in the wake of its closure in 2019, and includes 67 photographs, video, and an architectural installation that echoes the Lordstown assembly line in which the workers worked every day. The Last Cruise extends Frazier's longstanding commitment to visualizing how working class people are impacted by industrial exploits, environmental injustice, and systemic racism. Whether that is in the artist's hometown of Braddock, Pennsylvania, where she shot this image, chronicling the effects of the declining steel mill industry and noxious pollutants on the land and the people, including herself, her mother, and her grandmother, pictured here. Here is a work that came out of her time in Flint, Michigan, where she documented the Flint water crisis from the perspective of those who live and fight for their right to access free, clean water. Fraser recently visited CAM for a public discussion where she shared these projects openly and transparently and spoke to audiences about using her camera to tell the stories of frontline communities and how she works alongside her subjects and local artists in these communities to empower them as their own storytellers. If COVID allows, Fraser will be returning for 2 more visits to engage locally at CAM, and forthcoming programs connected to this exhibition include a panel on Black ecofeminism and another on the farm workers movement in California, demonstrating how one contemporary artist's work has become a platform by which we as a museum can explore a host of issues related to that body of work and environmental justice. I wanted to briefly share another project in development, this one made in collaboration with historian and scholar Allison Jefferson, who will be adapting her book, Living the California Dream, African-American Leisure Sites in the Jim Crow Era, into an exhibition at CAM in 2022. That exhibition will share the history and self-determination of African-Americans who fought for equal access to our state's outdoor offerings, including beaches, parks, and other recreational spaces during Jim Crow, and its implications for contemporary times. Jefferson's exhibition will include historical photographs, like the one you see here of the Bruce family on Bruce's Beach, a very timely image, promotional brochures, maps, newspaper articles, scrapbooks, videos, and more. In addition to sharing the history of African Americans who work to make the image of Southern California as the center for leisure and the American dream an open and inclusive reality, Jefferson is also imagining a host of public programs with current community groups and outdoor advocates that directly invite people of color into the outdoors. One of those groups is the Black Surfers Collective, who co-hosts Nick Galbadon Day, which is usually recognized in June to celebrate the first Black documented surfer in Southern California, and offer free surf and ocean safety lessons and beach ecology exploration to inspire a generation of Black youth to connect with their love of the beach. Here's an image of Galbadon surfing. So these are just 2 exhibitions that will be part of a slate unfolding over the next 5 years. And our hope is that as we continue along this initiative and this exploration, we can develop further the partnering opportunities available to us with our fellow departments in the Natural Resources Agency, MOI being one of them, to understand how we as a cultural institution can further amplify their work. We're already in dialogue with our California State Park Department and others, and I think it's really only an opportunity to think about how we can further align and amplify one another's goals. So thank you so much for letting me share these 2 projects with you. And Moi and I are happy to answer questions or hear reflections that you may have. Lacey, do we have any questions?
I haven't seen any come in the chat yet. But for those listening in, I encourage you to either unmute yourself if you feel comfortable asking your question, or type it in the chat box, and I'm happy to dictate if it is in the chat box.
How are you guys today?
Good,
Good.
thank you.
Doing well.
Excellent.
Yourself?
Not bad. So we have a Earth Science Museum here in Jurupa Valley, Riverside County. And our focus is mining and paleontology. And so I'd be curious as to see, what your thoughts are in trying to work with what we do and what you're doing. I'm at a loss of resources or knowledge to be able to try to make the connections. Exactly. Anything you can do to help would be appreciated.
That's a fascinating question. Can you tell me more what the museum does?
So we sit on 82 acres just north of the 60 freeway as you come into Riverside County. We have dinosaur sculptures around the property, trails to walk on. We have a 6,000 square foot museum with rocks, minerals, fossils, and paleontology exhibits. We are a curator from the Crestmore mine, where we have pictures and everything from the mine site that was there in our collection. We have a gift shop, a critter corner with live animals. We're an odd little eccentric place that would have been a, back along Route 66, we would have been one of those weird little oddities alongside the road. We're growing and maturing and turning ourselves into a museum as we go for our accreditation.
I'm curious, what is the feedback that's coming from your community?
Oh, they just like coming on. They just have fun with the dinosaurs. Everybody's happy.
I see a question from Pam, which is who worked in the mine? That was something that was also coming up for me as you were talking through the work that you do, is thinking about how the mining industry has impacted communities, both historically and currently. I'd be so curious to hear more about that.
So the mining industry, primarily, when it got started, it would have probably been primarily white, because they would have been doing the work. And then as the populations changed and evolved, we started building more of an African-American and Latino communities here. And they would have started working into the workforce. But initially, going back 100 years or so ago, it probably would have been all Anglo.
Moy, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I've just been thinking about like just the different elements and the questions that you've asked. I think it'd be important to share, or to for the museum as it's going through its exploration. When I think about when we work with communities, it's in relation to, right? So museum in relation to community. So I would be interested as to the California Native American tribes that were adjacent to that area that have that as an ancestral.
Gabrieliano, Cahuilla, Serrano, and Luciano.
Right. So it's
those four intersect here in the Jurupa Valley area. Jurupa Valley comes from a blending of Gabrieliano and Serrano for sagebrush.
Yeah, through this, at least through, as I'm thinking about the information that you're sharing, is, there's a collective learning of like, what was the shared histories before the space was there, then as the mining came to be, and that relationship there, and then present day, your present day patrons and how they could connect both shared histories, how they could connect, and why it's important for them to know what took place there, how it impacted, or how it did not impact their present lives, right? And then as community engagement is being done, and looking at the demographics of the people who are just adjacent to you, is what is the type of outreach that's being done to invite people in? What types of programs are being established to tie people into your space? Is the messaging, resonating with folks? And the way you kind of go about that is community meetings, community workshops, and being able to reach out to the folks that are doing on the ground working, within your area. Okay. Those are some initial thoughts that have come to mind.
The surrounding area, we have the mining area over here with the Crestmore mine, and then just to the west of us, there used to be a lot of dairy farms before all the development up and down the 50 and the 60. All that dairy work, it all moved out further out into the Inland Empire, out Roma land, and out further to the east. But when you used to be able to be around here, and You'd smell the cow poo and everybody would say, that's a smell of money. That was a standard story out in this area. But that's all moved away, and now you have housing developments that are built on top of the cow fields, and they have problems with the methane gas permeating through the floors up into the houses from decades and decades and decades of cow poo. So it's interesting.
Now, Wes, I welcome a further conversation on this. I think it's when we think about environmental justice, and it's a set of principles, but it's also not just about what we're showing in the galleries in the museum, right? We're not how you're telling a story, is who else is involved, and it's also when someone comes to your space is how they feel and experience that environment. So it's a little bit more nuanced, and it's case by case. So I welcome a conversation on this further.
Yeah, it's a odd little eccentric area that we live in.
Thank you for sharing it with us. Swati, I'm seeing your hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Moy and Cameron. This is wonderful. So my background, I'm an environmental justice and environmental health consultant. And so what I work on is with businesses kind of figuring out what materials they're using and making sure that they're not exposed to some of the harmful chemicals. And as we know, many of the harmful chemicals downstream are exposed to communities of color. They're the ones that are impacted with like hazardous waste sites, and just once we, are done with the items that we're working with. So I was curious for both of you, Moy and Cameron, with these exhibits and with the museums that you're working with, when these exhibits are taken down and downstream, what's happening with those materials? Because I think we need to think about that also, like who's going to be exposed to these items once the museums are done. So I'm just curious if there's conversations happening about that as well, when from the environmental justice lens, and then also when these exhibits are being put up, who may be exposed, like the custodians that are cleaning up some of these chemicals, et cetera. Are those conversations happening in both of your respective institutions? Thank you.
That's such a great question. Thank you for it. It is something that we're thinking about and talking about, which is how can materials be recycled? How can materials be kept in circulation? The majority of the materials that we use in our exhibitions either return to the artist or enter into, our museum to be used again and again. So it's something that we're definitely thinking about. I would also, I wish I had the name of it on the top of my head, but there is a Green Museums initiative, a larger coalition that is working to put together its chapter here in Los Angeles, which is really deeply interested in these issues. And Swati, if I have a moment to just kind of jog it and put it in the chat, I will, because I think the kinds of issues that you're talking about, I attended one of their first meetings as they were putting together the chapter together. And this was exactly the kinds of questions that were coming up there. So I think that would be a group of like-minded individuals to share resources with you.
Thank you so much.
I see a question from Jennifer. Are either you or I involved with the California Cultural Historical Endowment at CNRA?
I am not, but I believe my colleague, who's also just recently appointed, Geneva E.B. Thompson, is involved. And I know as we're being brought on, and as we're not only sharing our knowledge and expertise, but we're also learning. The agency is quite rich, not only in resources, but also in size. So there's so many great programs out there. So I will make sure to inquire with Geneva to see how her involvement. So thank you.
Jennifer, is there more that you wanted to say about the California Cultural Historical Endowment in regards to that question?
well, Celeste would probably make a better spokesperson, but let me take a whirl. And it's very nice to meet both of you. I'm here in Sacramento. I'm Nisanan Lan, and I represent California Association of Museums to the state capitol and to the agencies, et cetera. And I raised it because one of the things, as we have sought to get, try to engage the state in partnership in support of museum efforts across the state, we have, if you look back at the origin legislation that created CCHE, it was definitely a forerunner in California to lifting up untold stories and voices that don't often get heard. But it's a program that has not had any serious source of funding for many, many years. So we're learning as we go at, trying to advocate successfully and try to understand better how we might use CCHE to get more resources to it, to get empower more and more organizations around the state who might have, challenges getting funding to do just that, and would welcome input from you both, and thoughts as you get your, Moi, in your case, as you get your sea legs and your colleague, would love to engage, but I wanted to just lift that up, that we're always inspired by the kind of forming principles of CCHE, and it speaks to a lot of what you're talking about today.
Thank you for sharing that. I also see folks sharing in the chat some resources, the Sustainable Curating Manifesto. I want to lift that up from Danielle S. Also want to lift up stitchculturalheritage.org, which I believe the name is Mickaleen put into the chat, which is a resource to start looking at calculating the effects of chemicals and materials in collections and exhibitions. So Swati, two people who I think are sharing resources related to your question in the chat. Thanks everyone for your active use of the chat. Lacey says that she will collect and share resources from the chat via email after the program.
Thank you. And Jennifer, I would gladly follow up with you.
Thank you. Thank you both, Moises and Cameron, for your insight and for your expertise. Before we move on into the rest of the seminar, we're going to actually take a quick break to stretch. For those of you that would like to participate in the stretch break, feel free to turn your cameras off if you feel more comfortable doing that, and enjoy a 5-minute chair yoga session. We will resume the seminar program at approximately 1:50, and Lacey will share the chair yoga video with us in just a sec.